Good morning, everybody. So today we are taking up the 104th gate of the 108 Gates of Dharma-Illumination. And you may recall that this is this list of 108 gates appears in the 12 fascicle version of Dogen Shobogenzo. He did not compile it. It comes from a larger text called The Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. But somehow we thought this was an important list for us to investigate. So one by one, since 2016, I've been investigating these gates. So now we're at 104. We're closing in on the end. 104th gate says, attainment of the state of unrestricted speech is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for with it we cause all living beings totally to rejoice. I love the very modern totally to rejoice. So you might be thinking, well, we've talked about this gate already because we dealt with this state of unrestricted speech back at gate 101, which said entry into the state of unrestricted speech is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for with it we attain realization of the Dharma I. So you might remember we talked about that connection with wisdom and speech. So that one was about teaching the Dharma, discussing the Buddha's teachings as bodhisattvas from a place of unrestrictedness using this Dharma I, this particular eye of wisdom. So gate 102, that was gate 101. So gate 102 was about entering all conduct as the complete unhindered functioning of the universe. Gate 103 was about dharani, you might remember dharani, as memory, as well as incantation. We had already heard from Doju about dharani, and this one came a few weeks after that. This one was what dharani is memory, right? So remembering to see beyond our individual delusion and clearly see how the universe really works. And here we are again at gate 104 with unrestricted speech. So gates 101 and 104, I think, about unrestricted speech are sort of bookends. They're bookending gates about memory and conduct. So this says to me we're considering body, speech, and mind, right? Three things that create karma. So we have conduct, we have speech, we have memory. Somewhere in there, all the places that we create karma. So I think it's an interesting kind of grouping, right? It's really important, well, in medieval Asian lit anyway, but with a list like this, to look at what's around each gate, right? We look at each gate individually, but it's often, there's a reflection, what comes before it and what comes after, right? So it's really interesting to kind of look at these things as a group. So when we think about it, the first round of unrestricted speech was a manifestation of wisdom. We talked about Dharma I, right? This one is a manifestation of compassion, I think, bringing joy and delight to people, right? This is, unrestricted speech causing all living beings to rejoice. So I think we've got the wisdom on the one side and the compassion on the other side. So it's like, Gasho brings wisdom and compassion together, right? So let's review briefly what we learned about unrestricted speech a couple of weeks ago. Unrestricted speech comes from the point of view of unobstructed wisdom, unobstructed prajna. So it's how we speak and teach when we act from this place of really seeing clearly, deeply understanding impermanence, deeply understanding interdependence, emptiness, what these five skandhas are all about. So entering into, right, or attaining in this context is really to drop off body and mind. So we're not going to get to some place we're not already, right? We're not going to get something we don't already have. It's simply about dropping off body and mind, realizing there's already no separation, there's already no restriction or hindrance. So what's keeping us from entering into or attaining our five, is our five skandhas clinging to five skandhas. It's our ideas about what this is and how it works and what it isn't. Right? So if we can let go of the clinging, then we can easily enter into or attain whatever the state is. So unrestricted speech is not just about saying whatever we want. We come to this word or phrase like unrestricted speech. We might take that to mean, well, I should get on a box and say, whatever comes into my mind. I should be free to say whatever I want to say. So this is, so there's this feeling of not feeling held back or not feeling unsure or like thinking this gate is about having the courage to stand up and do something. Well, maybe so. But this restriction isn't about not having courage or not having motivation or begrudging the Dharma or something like that. It's about not getting tripped up by the three poisons. What is actually restricting our speech? What is restricting speech which is wise and compassionate? Well, nothing more than the three poisons, right? It's the basis of all of our suffering. So unrestricted here is muge, right? Without hindrance. You might recognize muge from the Heart Sutra. If you're here in the morning and you do the Sino-Japanese version, you might recognize muge. Koshin mukege komu ukuku, right? So thus the mind is without hindrance. Without hindrance, there is no fear. So this is the bodhisattva's experience of emptiness, right? This is the bodhisattva really understanding how this universe works. And indeed, this unrestrictedness is said to be a sort of defining characteristic of emptiness, if indeed we can define emptiness, right? If indeed we can put words around emptiness. This unrestrictedness is an important element of that, of experiencing that. So the Mahaparinirvana Sutra has a lot to say about unhinderedness and language in the functioning of the bodhisattva. On the basis of understanding emptiness, then the bodhisattva gains the four unhinderednesses, which is not good English, but right? The four unhinderednesses. So unhinderedness in, Dharma, in meaning, in language, and in eloquence. So the sutra says, in the unhindered knowledge of dharmas, one knows all things and their names. In the unhindered knowledge of meaning, one knows all about the meaning of things of the Dharma, arriving at the meaning by the names established for them. In unhindered knowledge of language, one knows the morphological, phonological, prosodical, and oratorical aspects of words. In unhindered knowledge of eloquence, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva has no hindrance in oratory and is unmoved. He has no fear, and it is difficult to defeat him. So we see a little bit of a relation to the Heart Sutra, right? So let's look at these things one by one. That was a lot going by. So unhindered knowledge of dharmas. So the Bodhisattva knows all the things that we encounter at all the various levels and stages of awakening. Now, we have to be careful about level and stages of awakening, right? In the older parts of the tradition, this was more linear. And in our tradition, we sort of sit down and awakening happens, and there's no kind of clinging to stages. But in the larger tradition, wherever we are on this path, Bodhisattva knows all the things that we encounter. So how we encounter name and form, how we take things in through the sense gates, how we provisionally give those things names, put labels on them, come to conclusions about them, right? So it is said that these bodhisattvas uphold the words of Dharma and don't forget them. Aha. Here we are again at memory and dharani, right? So the sutra says, upholding is like the actions of the earth, mountains, eyes, clouds, man, and mother. The same is the case with all things. So when we read this, we think, well, how do the earth and eyes and mothers uphold the Dharma? Well, they simply fully carry out their Dharma positions, right? Without having ideas about that, what that means, without being hindered by craving and aversion and getting stuck, right, in our stuff. So we have to move through the world being able to distinguish candy from poison and green lights from red lights, and right, we have to make distinctions. We have to put names on things because we can't do our bodhisattva work with other beings if we don't do that. We have to be able to talk about the Dharma in order to help people practice. So I have to sit here and say something about the Dharma, even though we know the Dharma can't be sort of enclosed in words, right? Even though language is limited, somehow we need to use these things, names and forms and words and language going forward. So bodhisattvas don't forget the words of the Dharma, and they don't forget to practice. So they get to hold both of these things. I know language is provisional, and also, I have to say something. I have to do something. So unhindered knowledge of dharmas. Unhindered knowledge of meaning. Bodhisattvas know that there appear to be three vehicles, right? There appear to be Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, or various paths of practice, let's just say. And they also know that these are actually all one vehicle. So they actually know there is one universe, there is one unified reality. There are multiple ways to approach that, to move through it, to consider it. And those things are important, we need them, but ultimately there's only one vehicle, right? So there's really only one Dharma. There's only one way the universe works. But we have to explain and understand Dharma according to conditions. So in this limited human form, at this point in my life, I understand certain things about the universe and about the Dharma. When I first began to practice, I saw things differently. If I'm still alive 20 or 30 years from now, I'll probably see it differently again. Each teacher teaches in a different way, teaches according to who's in front of him or her, uses appropriate language, right? So things may seem to mean different things depending on who we are and where we are and what we're working with at any given time, right? So bodhisattvas don't attach fixed meaning to names or vehicles or really, names of anything, words of any kind. So they understand the real meaning. They understand what things really signify. There's how things really are. And then there's the words we use and the meanings we attach and the way we interpret, right? So bodhisattvas don't get stuck there. They don't get blinded by their own interpretations, by their own meanings of things. They see the real meaning in addition to the provisional meaning. So in other words, they know the functions of things are not just the functions that we assign to them, right? They can let go of the what's in it for me sort of approach, right? This thing has a name and a function because it's useful to me in a certain way. Todo-san often uses the example. He says, this is a marker. As long as I can write with the marker, and as soon as it stops working, it's garbage, right? So the function for now is what I assign to it, but there's something else happening there which is bigger than me. So, bodhisattvas can let go of the what's in it for me and see the real Dharma position of things and really what they're doing without negating or ignoring the way we need to use things in this moment, right, to do our bodhisattva work. So unhindered knowledge of meaning. Unhindered knowledge of language. So bodhisattvas can give endless different names to things depending on the situation in order to speak in a relevant way. So not only do we have, we can look at different functions and different meanings, but bodhisattvas can give different names to things depending on what they need to do in that moment. So when we can't describe something in language, like emptiness or awakening or things that are ineffable, we sometimes have to use similes or metaphors or word pictures or some skillful way to try to make sense of that. So, if we're explaining something to somebody that has no experience of that thing, how do we do that, right? We need a reference point. So we might say, well, in a way, it's like this other thing that you already know about. Okay, it's not identical to that thing, but, can we begin to make a connection for somebody? So all of that is skillful means. So different names of things can illuminate different aspects of that same thing. And bodhisattvas don't get stuck with just one point of view, right? So we know that many descriptions are relative. It's something is large or small compared to something else, right? Something is similar to something but not identical to something. Bodhisattvas can see and appreciate any particular name and viewpoint, but also not get stuck with that and also recognize, well, it's a reflection of other things, right? So it's like a big hall of mirrors where all the meanings, all the candle lights, all the elements are reflecting each other, or like Indra's net where all the dharmas are connected to each other and reflect each other, right? So again, this is the teaching about this is there is no fixed meaning. There is no fixed name. There is no fixed function about what is this about for me, right? So this whole thing is very much about opening the hand. So finally, unhindered knowledge of eloquence. So bodhisattvas, in the course of innumerable kalpas, innumerable time, talk about all dharmas to all beings using endless names and meanings and ideas. So this is where we really blow the whole thing open, right? So bodhisattvas talk to anybody at any time, in any place, using any names, terms, forms, ideas, similes, pictures, stories that they need to in order to teach the Dharma. So they can talk to anybody. They can talk to anybody about anything at any time without running out of material. So maybe we all know people who seem to have an endless need to talk and an endless supply of things to say. Right? Talk. Stories, examples, illustrations, whatever, right? So, So yes, the bodhisattva can speak for a long time, never run out of material, but also I would suggest that an important aspect of eloquence is knowing when to be silent. So there's the talk, talk, talk kind of communicating, right? Teaching, preaching. And then there is, when is it a good time to simply be silent? And maybe what's communicating is simply our presence, or the way we're behaving, or the actions we take in the world, right? You know, when you've said enough and people just need time to like take that in, or when words are not the right tools, sometimes the eloquence piece is about being silent. So it goes beyond the words and the meaning and the ideas, right? So bodhisattvas have complete knowledge of each of these four things, all the nuances, all the subsets, what to do in every case. And yet every time Buddha says they don't cling to anything about those four things. So the sutra describes each of these things, and at the end of each section, again, Buddha says, and they don't cling to that. They know all about this, they're really skillful with this, they can do all of this, and they don't cling to that. So they know that the way they use language is the best and most effective way for whatever is going on, but they don't cling to any particular approach or any particular language. So this is unrestricted speech, right? They're ready to give it up. They're ready to switch to something else at any time, pull something else out of the bag of tricks. And they know that the Dharma can't really be expressed in words, right? But they do it anyway. So this is the interesting intersection we walk with speech, right? There's so many teachings about speech in this tradition, and this is the interesting intersection, right? We have to say something, and yet the Dharma can't always be expressed in words. So somebody, in this end of this section in this sutra, somebody asks the Buddha how there can be knowing if there's no clinging. So how can we say we know about these four things and are skillful with them and can use them and, you know, do our bodhisattva work with them when there's no clinging? How can we make use of them if we're not grasping them? And the Buddha says, clinging is not unhinderedness. When there is no clinging, there is unhinderedness. Hence, any bodhisattva who has any clinging is not one unhindered. If not unhindered, he is no bodhisattva. Know that such a person is a common mortal. So he goes on to say, ordinary people cling to their five skandhas. Yeah, right? We're always five skandhas clinging to five skandhas. That leads to greed. That leads to suffering, being bound to this samsaric world of birth and death. In other words, these are people who are not liberated from suffering, like the bodhisattva is liberated from suffering. So ordinary people don't have these four unhinderednesses of the bodhisattva, and they're unable to offer this kind of unrestricted speech that this gate says leads people totally to rejoice. So this unrestricted speech of the bodhisattva is based in a complete understanding, a complete awareness of emptiness, what emptiness is, how that works. And as we saw in the Heart Sutra, this is the mind without hindrance. And again, this isn't just everyday speech we're talking about. This is, in this gate, it's particularly about sharing the Dharma. Now, although there are myriad ways that happens, right? We're all sharing the Dharma in some way all the time, whether we intend to do that or not. We're all engaged with somehow communicating what exactly is going on with us at any given moment, the thusness of this moment. So yes, you can wear these things and talk about the Dharma. But I would say this gate is not unrelated to all of us as practitioners. This is not just aimed at Dharma teachers, right? We're all bodhisattvas engaged in speaking, communicating the Dharma, transmitting the Dharma in some way. So we've spent plenty of time over the course of all these gates, right, talking about speech. The new wrinkle, I think, this week in this gate is that this is the kind of speech that results in joy and delight for others. So this delight and joy is not the pleasure we get from taking in whatever we're taking in, fun and exciting sensations through the sense gates and through the body, and then deciding that's a good fun thing and chasing after more of them, right? This is not the joy and delight we're talking about here. It's not just about sort of helping folks get more chocolate cake and cherry pie. This kind of joy specifically refers to the skillful operation of the sixth level of consciousness. So now we need to briefly review, right, all these levels of consciousness, what they are. For that, we can return to the Heart Sutra, because the Heart Sutra is familiar territory for us, right? Of course, it appears in other places, but it's a nice, succinct summary. So the sutra lists the 5 skandhas that make up this thing called I or me, right? Form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness. Then it lists the 6 sense gates, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And then it intersects those 2 things to make 6 kinds of consciousness. So each one is a connection between the consciousness and one of the sense gates. So eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose, tongue, body, mind. It's this 6th one, mind consciousness, that we're concerned with, related to delight and joy and causing beings to rejoice. So mind consciousness involves awareness and recognition and memory. And here we are again. Right? So this is using these things to understand all the other 5 consciousnesses. So to understand eye consciousness, or what's coming in visually, to understand ear consciousness, what's coming in through the ears, right? All the way down the list. So something comes in through, say, the sense of smell. It's something I've smelled before. Oh, I recognize this is incense, or this is an orange, or this is fish, or something, right? I remember what to do with that. Maybe I take some action based on that. There can be some part of this process where I decide whether or not I personally like this smell or dislike it or don't care about it. I form some opinion about it. Maybe that happens, but what if that isn't a requirement? What if we can just take in that information and not immediately switch to judging, liking, disliking, picking, choosing, chasing, avoiding? So I can recognize something. I can take appropriate skillful action about it without getting caught up in my own story and distorting that experience, right? So I can remember maybe a past association. I can identify what this thing is and how it functions without writing a story about it. Isn't that an interesting place to be? We kind of don't assume that's even possible until somebody points it out. So that's when joy and delight arises. That's not based on my personal self-clinging, my personal need for something, or to chase or avoid something. That's the kind of rejoicing in this gate statement. Attainment of the state of unrestricted speech is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for with it we cause all living beings totally to rejoice. So how can we speak in such a way that that others arouse this joy and delight that's based on wisdom and compassion, and not on the 3 poisons, not on greed, I want something, anger, I don't want something, ignorance, I have no idea what's going on, right? How can we do that? So we talked about sympathetic joy all the way back at gate 16 as one of the 4 Brahma Viharas, or the 4 divine abodes, right? So the classical image of sympathetic joy is the joy of a parent when the child is healthy and grows and develops and prospers. Parents feel very connected to their children, right? This is nurturing mind. So they're happy when these children learn to walk and talk, and they do well in school, and they get a date for the prom, and they, get a good job, right? Parents are rejoicing when those things happen. So how do we cultivate or create conditions for this kind of sympathetic joy? How do we use speech to help others create those kinds of conditions? Because it's actually not so easy to be happy for somebody else, right, without a little bit of envy. This is the human condition. Something good happens to somebody. Well, that's very nice, but, right, there's this little something in here, right? So it's not so easy to do this, although it sounds very nice. So sometimes it seems like our contentment and somebody else's contentment can't really coexist. If he gets something, it comes at some expense to me. So if she's happy, it shows me how unhappy I really am. There's always something, right? Some hindrance there. It's so easy to pull out the yardstick and start measuring and comparing as if there's sort of a finite amount of joy and delight in the world, and we sort of have to fight each other for it. I want to get my part, and that's, if I get my part, you don't get your part. It's the human condition. So the bodhisattva understands there is no fixed, permanent, independent self in these 5 skandhas that needs to be defended that way. So one person's happiness doesn't have to be a threat to somebody else's happiness. So it doesn't hurt me to be happy for you when something good happens to you. If we practice and we loosen the grip of this idea that there is this fixed, unchanging self-nature that persists through time, that we need to defend, we need to shore it up, it needs things in order to be okay, right? Then we simply get to feel somebody else's joy. Then what comes out of our mouths can be about causing other people to totally rejoice without feeling like that's somehow a sacrifice on my part. I'm being a martyr because I'm doing something which enables somebody else, but it comes at a cost to me. Nobody's keeping score, man. Right? So, sympathetic joy doesn't mean we can't be happy for ourselves when something happens. Doesn't mean we should have no happiness and contentment ourselves and that we should give that all away. Doesn't mean that others can't be happy for us when something good happens. Does mean that we're not so caught up in our own craving and aversion and stuff that the only pleasure and delight we get comes from gratifying our own clinging. If that's our only source of joy and contentment, then we've missed something. So Sawaki Roshi said, in everything, people follow their feelings of joy, anger, sadness, and comfort. But that's something different from everyday mind. Everyday mind means ceasefire. Without preferences, without animosity, without winner and loser, without good and evil, without joy and pain, that's everyday mind. So ceasefire, I think that's really interesting. We can let go of this sort of burning need to win. We can live without this winner and loser and good and evil and using what he's calling here everyday mind. This is the unhindered mind, right? Unrestricted mind. So seeing the way the bodhisattva sees from the perspective of emptiness. So then ceasefire is this unhinderedness, right, of the bodhisattva that we saw a minute ago. Different from the common mortal who's stuck in the burning world of samsara. Ceasefire, isn't that interesting? You know, it's like, oh, I'm going to stop with the aggression and the separation and the tug of war. So the Gates statement says, unhindered speech causes living beings to rejoice. And rejoice is an interesting word because originally it meant to bring joy to others rather than to feel some joy and delight in ourselves. Oh, I'm rejoicing because such and so happened to me. Rejoice originally meant bringing joy to others. So it's interesting that this is the word that gets used. So, okay, now we know what we mean by rejoicing. We know what we mean by unrestricted speech. We move through the world carrying out our activities and at the same time recognizing whatever we encounter for what it truly is, calling it by an appropriate name for those circumstances without getting stuck in the labeling or any particular worldview. So we can talk to anyone in any situation and explain things clearly without the hindrance of our own biases and our agendas and maybe our ignorance, greed, anger, and ignorance. On that basis, we can help others to take skillful action and lessen their suffering. So we don't have to do that in a big, grandiose, overt way. It can simply be, how do we move through the world as skillful beings? So when the three poisons quiet down, then we can all recognize the joy, the contentment, the delight that's already there, which has nothing to do with how much cherry pie have I got. So it has to do with seeing we can enjoy the cherry pie and we can also live without it. So if I have cherry pie today, great. I can rejoice in that. I can enjoy it. But if I don't have it tomorrow, that doesn't mean I have no contentment, joy, delight, reason for getting out of bed. So interestingly, in order to experience joy, we have to liberate ourselves from our own ideas about joy. Otherwise, when we get stuck in what we think joy is, we miss it, right? So if I think happiness is tied only to feeding these 5 skandhas, then my whole life becomes samsara, chasing after things, avoiding things simply to take care of these 5 skandhas. So if I'm caught up in that stuff, there's no way I can help anybody else. You know, not only do I maybe not experience my own rejoicing, there's no way I'm going to help somebody else do that because I'm so fixated on like what these 5 skandhas need. So attainment of the state of unrestricted speech is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for with it we cause all living beings totally to rejoice. Now this is an interesting gate to consider in light of a piece of recent research from the Pew Center. I tend to pay attention to Gallup and Pew and just see what the world is thinking, how the world sees things, right? So interestingly, 2/3 of women say that in the past year they have personally thought a lot or some about big questions like, is there any purpose to suffering? Or why do terrible things happen to people? So 2/3 of women are thinking about these things. 55% of men are thinking about these things. So clearly People, of course, this is coming out of the pandemic, right? Where A, we had a lot of suffering and it was pretty close to home, and B, we had a lot of time to sit at home and think about why was this happening, right? But still, I got to think, we're not unconcerned about suffering. So when seeing or hearing about terrible things happening to people, 71% of women and 53% of men say they often feel sad for those who are suffering. The key word here is often. We'll see in a minute. 46% of women and 34% of men report often feeling the desire to help those who are suffering. So nearly everybody reported feeling these things sometimes. More than 90% of people overall said, when terrible things happen to people, I feel sad sometimes, and sometimes I feel like I should help. So the key here is sometimes and often. 71% of women, 53% of men often feel sad, but 46% of women, 34% of men often want to help. So there's a lot more I feel sad for others than I feel a desire to help them, which I think is interesting. So interestingly, about a third of people say they often or sometimes feel happy if the person suffering seems to have deserved it. Right? And about 10% of people often feel this way. Wow, that's kind of something. That's not sympathetic joy. That is the opposite of sympathetic joy. Pleasure in somebody else's suffering. I'm not condemning these people. I just say this is really interesting that there is enough of a perception in the world like that. So this is the human condition, right? We're hardwired as human beings to compete and to survive, and it's very deeply held. Doesn't make us bad people. It says there's something in there in our evolution, right, that says we need to compete and survive. So it's the condition of the quote-unquote common mortal, right, that we heard about earlier. It's not the condition of the bodhisattva. So we might ask ourselves why, even when we empathize, we feel sad for somebody who's suffering, empathize with them, we don't always feel the desire to help, because it was a pretty significant drop. Well, I mean, if we think about it, things come up. We can see why this happens, right? Sometimes we just plain feel overwhelmed, either by compassion fatigue or by its cousin, news fatigue. News fatigue, so it's compassion fatigue if we're like directly working with people who are suffering. News fatigue affects between 2/3 and 4/5 of people at least sometimes. They're just saying, I've got to shut off the news, there's too much suffering and I just can't take in anymore. So frequently, part of it is just we're overwhelmed. I think frequently we often don't know what to do to be helpful. And this is a topic that comes up over and over again in our Wednesday night group and sometimes here on Sundays. In a samsaric world on fire, what can I personally possibly do that would make any difference at all? Right? So we become paralyzed and we think, well, I can't do anything because I can't do everything. Right? I can't make the world stop going to war. I can't feed all the hungry children. I can't erase all the disease in the world. What can I possibly do as one small karmic human being that will make any difference? And thinking about this is a big question, I think, in our spiritual life. So it makes a lot of sense. Well, how about simply speaking to everybody we encounter as a bodhisattva would speak to them? Right? We're speaking all the time. We're communicating all the time. As soon as our eyes are open in the morning, practically. If we're not speaking to a partner, we're online, or we're going to work, or we're going to the store, right? We're speaking all the time. Speech is a frontline activity when we're connecting with people. So it's a hugely important practice opportunity anyway in the Soto Zen tradition. What did we just say at the beginning? We've spent how many gates talking about unrestricted speech? We have precepts about this. We have, all kinds of teachings in the Eightfold Path and lots of places. How do we think about speech? Body, speech, and mind, right? So again, this is, we can pay attention to our habits of speech such that at least we're not causing more suffering. If we can't immediately bring rejoicing in the streets to people, can we at least not perpetuate suffering? So, maybe we can be catalysts for a little bit of joy. Is it that hard to say something to somebody which makes that person smile, or drop a bit of stress, or just take a breath? One of my favorite things to do, especially around a busy, like holiday time or something, if I'm in the store or I'm in the post office, and the workers are running around and they're trying to serve everybody, and they get to me and they look harassed, I will say, I am not in a hurry, take your time. And they go, thank you. Because they've been grumbled at and groused at by every person in line all day long. I'm in a hurry, I need. I go, you know, I'm not in a hurry. It's okay. And they go, oh, I have time to change the register tape. You know, I mean, it's such a simple thing. And I'm not special. I'm just saying there's ways, right, that we can bring a little bit of joy to somebody, be a little bit of a catalyst for somebody. This is not a matter of simply being polite. You know, we need to look at our habituated speech patterns, our habituated thinking, but it's not politeness that we're talking about here. Simply, you know, cultivating a habit of being polite. It's deeper than that. These are habits of thought that leads to habit of speech. So we need to practice as bodhisattvas and cultivate wisdom to see things as they really are. And then the speech that comes out of our mouths is naturally unhindered. It is naturally compassionate. It is naturally going to promote some joy, or at least not create suffering. So it can be as simple as actually paying attention to people. Golly. That sounds so easy and so simple, and like we take that for granted. And we all know how many times we've had conversations with people while half the brain is somewhere else. Or someone's talking and I'm spending that whole time thinking about what I'm going to say. So I don't actually hear what gets said. I don't answer the question that person is asking because I'm already formulating my answer, right? So what if instead we actually paid attention to people? Whether these are work people or friends or someone ringing the register, right? If it's somebody we know a little bit, how about asking that person questions about him or herself rather than talking only about me? And actually listening to the answers, right? You don't want to be pushy. This isn't an interview, but like, what if you were actually present with that person? Being actually interested in those answers. You know, asking because of a sincere spirit of inquiry. So, you know, we bring that spirit of inquiry to our zazen practice. When we sit down on the cushion, you know, we drop off body and mind, and we kind of open our hands, and we say, well, whatever's coming at me is going to come at me, and this is a safe place for that to happen, right? We allow that in zazen. What if we took that same spirit of inquiry into the rest of the world, into our relationships, into our conversations, into the rest of our lives? We all know how lovely it is to feel like somebody cares what I think. Somebody cares how I am. Somebody cares how I see the world, right? How my life is going. That's an important kind of joy. That is not, you know, throw a party kind of joy. That is just like, man, I feel okay. Things are all right. Yes, I'm suffering, but somebody acknowledges that I'm suffering and thinks I'm going to make it through. Thinks I have the ability to turn that around, right? That is joy. That is a really interesting kind of joy. So, you know, is that going to stop the war in the Middle East? Well, no. You know, is that going to rebuild temples damaged in the Japanese earthquake? Is that going to stop disease from happening? No, it won't. But it might cause the person you're talking to not to say or do something that causes more suffering in the next encounter, or more suffering for themselves. And isn't that where it all starts? If this is somehow out of order, it's pretty difficult to help somebody else. So can we simply help other people straighten themselves up little by little, right? One small, skillful act at a time. So I'll end today with a bit of the Avatamsaka Sutra that seems to pull together all the last 4 gates that I mentioned in the beginning this morning. And again, we're going to hear about conduct, speech, and memory, or body, speech, and mind. So, unhindered is the Buddha's knowledge that all is illusory. He clearly comprehends all things in all times. Delving into the mental patterns of all sentient beings, this is the realm of skillful teaching. The bounds of his total recall are not to be found. The ocean of his eloquence is also unlimited. He is able to turn the wheel of the pure, subtle truth. This is the liberation of great light. The nature of actions is vast and inexhaustible. His knowledge comprehends it and skillfully explains. All his methods are inconceivable. Such is the entry of wisdom. Turning the wheel of inconceivable truth, demonstrating and practicing the way of enlightenment, forever annihilating the suffering of all sentient beings. So what would you like to say about unrestricted speech and causing others to be joyful and rejoicing? Thoughts, ideas, questions, reflections. Let's start with the people here, and then we'll move to the people there, just so we can make sure everyone gets seen and heard. Anything in the room this morning? Nobody feels the power of unrestricted speech? How about folks at home? Sawyer, anybody with a hand up over there?
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Neil, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for the talk today. When you were speaking about maybe the pleasure we take when we feel that people who deserve it are suffering, yeah, I recognize that, and I feel like that can be a challenge. That part of it, we want to believe we live in a just world, but also that some of those emotions are maybe the habits we have to try to hold one another accountable. And so, yeah, I think of the challenge of how do we let go of that while also kind of aiming our actions skillfully to still nurture like a harmonious society. How do we don't let people, or how do we inspire those who are seem to be less motivated to care for the health of the community?
Yeah, so compassion is not condoning, right? Awareness and acknowledgement is not approval. So there's a difference between recognizing unskillful behavior and doing that in a way which is there's self-clinging about that, right? So we can recognize people make mistakes, including us. And they come from greed. Those mistakes come from greed, anger, and ignorance, and we certainly don't need to be doormats about that. If bad things are happening, sometimes the skillful thing is to stand up and say something bad is happening. Can we do that without being caught up in our own self-clinging, our own greed, anger, and ignorance, our own need to be right or to be visible or something, right? When we see somebody taking unskillful action, or in this case, saying unskillful things, the human response is we get angry. As soon as we get angry, we can be less effective as bodhisattvas, right? So I think there's two parts to what you're bringing up. One is, what is my response to what I'm seeing and hearing? And how do I skillfully look at that and see where it's coming from and acknowledge that my response is based on my own stuff? And still, even with that happening, going forward as a bodhisattva and trying to liberate beings from suffering, trying to end or change or turn something which is happening which we think is unhealthy, unwholesome, right? So we have both of these things to do. This is the perennial challenge of being engaged in the world as bodhisattvas, right? So we may not, I think we have to be careful about the yardstick, because we can put a yardstick up for ourselves that says, I'm not being a good bodhisattva if I don't see this and this and this and this result in the world. And this is why we have the being paralyzed, because we can't do everything, so we don't do anything. It's like, okay, what is the measure of making a difference, right? The measure of making a difference might simply be, I see somebody doing something unskillful and I vow not to do that thing, right? We can learn something from that, right? So we have to be really careful about very strong responses, very strong personal reactions can come up when we hear fighting words. This is an election time. We're going to hear a lot of stuff. This is an interesting time to start talking about unrestricted speech. The condition of our national dialogue at this moment is, well, let's just say troublesome, right? So this is a really good time to think about, okay, I'm hearing stuff. What am I doing with that? How am I responding to that? Am I taking actions based on that? And then what am I putting back out? And it doesn't mean we should not be engaged. It doesn't mean we should hide in a hole. It doesn't mean somehow that it's impure or not dharmic or something, right? To try to make a difference, but we have to do that in really skillful ways. So I think this is why it's really interesting how much this today is focused on. We have several kinds of skillful speech or other activity, and yet the bodhisattva doesn't cling to any of them. You know, if we've said something and it's not working, we don't keep doing more of that, right? We're not going to make a difference. We have to switch it up and do something else. So how in that moment can we be flexible? How in that moment can we see what's really going on and then use the right thing, make the right response, use the right tool, and not get stuck with any of them? So, you know, sometimes you meet force with force, but sometimes you meet force with something else, right? So, of course, there's no easy answer to that. But what you're bringing up is, I think, the key practice point of this, right? So, do you have something else you'd like to say about that? I didn't answer your question because there's no answer.
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Other folks at home or in the room? Mark, while he's getting ready, Mark, why don't you?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose, you know, I'm reminded of a conversation that I had over the holidays where a friend of mine was telling me about a flight that was being delayed, that they couldn't get to, and everything in the world in their mind depended on them getting home at that particular time. And so then they were up there talking to the person at the desk, and meanwhile there's all these other people who can't get their flight, and they're like, what do you mean you're telling me you can't get me back tonight? You know, I am a whatever silver club member of this different types of thing.
Yep.
And then she was reflecting back on that. I was talking to me, it's like, I'm not the type of person who does this. Why did I, like, how did I come into that particular mindset at that particular time? It's like, well, clearly you are the type of person who does this. And you're the type of person who does this because you're a human being. And sometimes when we get into our own little, the wheels start turning, it's hard to come back from that, especially if you have this idea on what me getting home looks like to the people around me and who's affected. It seems like that is like your ultimate, like, fighting for justice or something like that, to get you home on that plane, even before everybody else who's got their own reasons that they need to get there back on that plane at the time. But you know, it's like, well, they might be the type of person who does do that, and maybe I would too if I was in that circumstance. I don't know. They're also the type of person that comes back later, reflects on that, and thinks about that. It's like, why did I do that? How did I slip into this particular type of thing? And I think it's one of the things that is always a little bit helpful if I'm in that particular environment and I see a person acting like that. Like, you know, I think that kind of comes down with, like, the condoning doesn't mean, or that the you know, acceptance, compassion doesn't mean condoning, that a person can be going through this and it's like, oh, the way that they're acting right now is actually putting themselves above other people. It is not the most loving act that they can be generating in that moment. And yet, if I'm in that particular circumstance at that particular time and I'm just not in the peace of mind to reflect on it, maybe I'm doing the exact same thing, and maybe I have done the exact same thing in a lot of ways and haven't thought about it in return. And so I guess, I don't know if this really has an answer either, as much as to say that I feel like it's a kind of somewhat a constant battle to be able to prevent ourselves from getting into that mindset.
Sure. Well, I think you've raised the question and the answer, right? Yeah. You know, we're all going to make mistakes. And when we're under duress, we get more like ourselves, and our world, you know, we get tunnel vision, and the world view shrinks, and the available tools we have shrink, and we just keep pounding with that hammer, right? To have the ability either then or later, though, to step back and go, what just happened here? You know, to have a little bit of spaciousness, even if it's after the fact. Sometimes you can remedy something and go to somebody and say, gee, I'm sorry for what I did. Sometimes you can't, right? So yes, compassion is not condoning, awareness is not approval. Things will happen, and yet, you know, sometimes we can cultivate some habits around, oh, I feel myself, I feel the duress coming, I feel the stress and duress coming. This is the time to be careful what I say. This is the time to watch what's going on in my body. This is the time to go, okay, wait a minute, what's happening? Because we tend to not look at what's happening. You know, the worldview kind of shrinks, right? So yes, we're all caught up in the three poisons. We've all got greed, anger, and ignorance, and when we're under duress, those things come out. So one of the habits we can cultivate is, okay, I feel it happening. Let me be careful what I do here, because if I can say something that makes me feel really good in this moment and destroys the other person, but ultimately is that helpful? Probably not. Yeah. Travel brings that out in people, doesn't it? Well, because as you say, it's very much about who am I if I don't get home? Who am I in this organization relative to the people around me who don't have my status? I mean, we just immediately go for like 5 skandhas and defending 5 skandhas. Like, what if I don't do that? Am I any more likely to get a seat on a plane? If I pound on people or if I don't pound on people, I don't know. So I think what you've raised is a very human scenario. Yeah. Was there somebody else at home?
No.
Okay. Clark,
I
please.
like what you said, the Kodosawaki quote about ceasefire.
Ceasefire. Ceasefire, yes.
Well, what I was thinking to myself was that the self is always comparing,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And that's where a lot of the animosity comes from.
Yep.
Like if someone does something that offends me, immediately I'm like, how could you do that? Whatever. And one day I had this little voice in my head when someone did something, and I thought, that's me when I'm in that state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately the comparing is gone because
Mhm.
we're the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that unity is really what the ceasefire is all about. And
Yep.
to me, that's the state of mind I have to have before I can even try to help somebody. Because if I'm comparing, they're going to pick up on it and it's over.
Right, well, you've created separation, right? So what you're talking about is identity action, right? We've just spent a long time on Wednesdays talking about the Shishobo. Yeah, so can I see myself in that other person? Because there's already no separation, right? But we've all had that day where we stubbed our toes and forgot our keys and did something, and then something comes out of the mouth. Okay, somebody's suffering here. Clearly, somebody who's being unskillful is somebody who's caught up in 3 poisons. Can I at least have a little compassion for that, even if I don't like what they're doing? Yeah, I think what you're talking about is important. Can I see myself in that other person before I go retaliating?
Because I'm less likely to shoot them if I think
Exactly. Yeah. Well, if this person isn't my enemy, ceasefire.
Right.
If this person isn't separate from me, ceasefire. So I just think that was a really interesting way for him to put, as a veteran of the military, that was a really interesting way for him to put that. So that we think about that whole process as a ceasefire process. Oh, isn't that interesting? Samsara world on fire. Yeah. Other comments, reflections? Please, Owen.
So I'm really interested in the kind of pulling apart that you were talking about, of like this kind of joy that comes from emptiness or non-clinging or however, and then like the joy that comes from the senses and the however, right? And if we're able to pull those things apart, I think an interesting thing that can come up is moments where a more emptiness flavored joy can arise, but the senses are in pain. The senses are feeling very uncomfortable.
Yep.
And since what we're interested in is ways that my actions can cause, or speech in particular, can cause joy for this person, you'd imagine that there's situations where I can cause joy, but in this more sensory sense, also like pain, suffering, or not suffering, I suppose, but discomfort, right? Where the right thing to do, or the compassionate thing to do, is actually a painful thing for that other person, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that the really challenging question is like, how do I know I have the right? How do I know I have like the permission to make that choice for that person?
Yep. Yep. Well, of course, there is no good answer to that, right? I think the best we can do is to make sure that whatever pain we're about to cause is not based on our own ego. I need to cause you pain in order for me to feel better. And there's a lot of colors of that. I need to cause you pain so I feel better because I'm more skillful than you. Not, I'm going to cause you pain because I don't like you. I'm going to cause you pain because this is for your own good and I know better than you do. Really? Maybe. It's hard to know. So I think what you're bringing up is the need to at least have enough spaciousness before whatever comes out of the mouth to say, what's the real motivation for this, and can I really be honest with myself? Right? Am I really doing this because I think it's the most skillful thing to do, or is there any kind of self-clinging involved? Because sometimes the skillful thing to do is to say something which makes somebody uncomfortable. And that's the tough thing the bodhisattva has to do, and then accept that karma. Somebody might not be happy with me for a while if I say this thing which I really, in my deepest heart, think I need to say to him or her or them. Okay, then the karma, I accept that karma as a bodhisattva, knowing that, having really sort of carefully considered that, yes, I think this is the skillful thing to do. It's not easy, is it? Yeah. It can be a very compassionate thing to do and a very wise thing to do, but it doesn't always make people rejoice. At least in the moment it doesn't. Other things from people? Reflections? Comments? Here or at home? Please.
Along the lines of the questioning of human relationships and so forth, our Buddhist ideal of no separation, of course, that's not really something, that's just something that is, right? But in human dynamics, we often have to set boundaries. And so that can be a tension. I wonder if you could discuss that a little bit, the tension between setting needed boundaries in human relationships and maintaining a sense of no separation.
Sure. So I think we can certainly set boundaries as a skillful means, because sometimes, so taking care of all beings doesn't let out taking care of ourselves, right? If we're in a toxic situation and somebody's coming at us and we really need that behavior to stop for our own well-being so that we can turn around and help somebody else, we need to do that. We need to set boundaries, say that kind of behavior is not acceptable. That is not okay. It causes suffering and pain and whatever for me or for others, or you're going to hurt yourself, right? You take sharp objects away from small children because they're going to hurt themselves or somebody else. We have to set boundaries. So setting a boundary doesn't mean I'm separate from you. It says I'm describing our connection. I'm describing maybe this other person. I'm advocating a certain kind of connection between this other person and the world. So I think setting a boundary is not cutting off. I think setting a boundary is describing that transaction. It's describing that relationship. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I've confronted this a couple of times recently where a person was being excessively verbally abusive toward me. And I found it necessary
That's not
to say,
okay.
okay, this is the end of this relationship.
Yes.
I'm not talking to you anymore.
Yes. Yes, you can do that without creating separation, because how many millions and billions of people are there in the world that you don't see every day, that you don't talk to every day, but you're not disconnected from because of just the nature of interconnectedness, right? So you're not cutting that person off because you have ill will toward that person. You're saying, for everybody's well-being, this kind of interaction needs to not happen. I think you can do that without ill will, although that might be hard, right? Other things about that, or anything else? Anyone at home? Are we done? Nope. One at home? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Abby.
I'm just thinking about Neil's response, about that slight, maybe pleasure or justification that we get when someone gets what we think they deserve. And I find that this is kind of a ridiculous example, but I do find that often it's my degree of identification with the misdeed of the other that creates that rather sharp, unsympathetic response in me. And I'm just thinking this morning, we have a cat who is a clamorer for food, constant. You can't go in the kitchen without being just bowled over by all these cries and begging noises, even when she's not hungry. And I think that I was probably a child who was taught not to clamor. And as a result, I have a very remarkable response to what is a little cat has no self-consciousness whatsoever about her behavior. And I get very annoyed. And I think that it's actually easier for me to make that understanding that compassion and condoning are not the same, with much greater forms of mistake. Whereas it's very difficult for me with this cat because there's some kind of identification going on. So I know that's sort of silly, but I think there's some truth.
Well, what's interesting is I have a cat that does the same thing, and it makes me crazy. Even when he's not hungry, he's all over me, yowling and yowling and yowling. Yeah. Well, I didn't hear the last.
Thank you for the talk.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, so it's interesting when we consider a person who's talking at you all the time and asking for things all the time, and you think, well, that person's got some ability to choose. Maybe we can turn that around a bit by having an explanation. When it's animals, you can explain it to them. How do you continue to have compassion and not be annoyed by this animal that you can't explain it to? And it's funny how much we try, right? We keep talking to the animals thinking they're going to get it. Sometimes they just don't.
That's me when I'm always wanting.
There you go. Yeah. Well, so isn't it interesting? Couldn't we put ourselves in the place of the animal? And as Abby says, to do some identifying and say, well, this is sort of the unrestricted speech of an animal that doesn't know how to not communicate its needs immediately, right? Yeah, it's on the one hand, I think with animals we have some immediate compassion because they're not people, and on the other hand, we can get incredibly annoyed because we can't explain it to them, right? So yeah, all of our interactions. So although frequently I'm saying, bringing joy to other people, what this really says is bring joy to other beings. So how are we moving through the world with other beings? With all the beings on the planet, are we behaving in such a way that we cause suffering, or are we behaving in such a way that we're nurturing life and not taking life, right? So when we look at something like the first precept, we just think, because we're looking at that at our last Ryakusatsu, it seems so simple, just don't kill stuff. Okay, I'm not a murderer. Check. And then we think about what does cutting off really mean? What does cutting off something really mean? And it's just how are we moving through the world, and are we doing that in such a way that we're fostering relationships, connection, joy, rejoicing, or not, right? So there's multiple ways to look at that precept. Anyway, I've wandered from cats. So our interaction with our animals can certainly be a wonderful mirror, a wonderful reflection. What's coming up for me? Because I can't do anything about it. That cat's going to keep shrieking at me. It's going to keep happening. So like, what do I get to observe about myself? Other things, please? Try catnip. Oh, this particular cat does not respond to catnip. So yeah, there's no hope. All right, anything else this morning before we move on to our world peace? We okay for today? All right, so let's do our closing chant, and we will move on to our announcements and our world peace. So thank you, everybody.